Hello there and welcome. Today we're going to go over your staff for your F1 Manager team, what they do, what kind of benefits they bring to the team, and generally which ones you should focus on first and where you should potentially spend your money. Now, if you find this video to be beneficial or helpful, I would appreciate it if you would like to subscribe, as that helps me. But with that said, let's just jump straight into it. For your staff, you currently have 5 important members: your technical chief, your head of aerodynamics, your spawn director, and of course your 2 race engineers. Now, when it comes to your technical chief and your head of aerodynamics, they work very similarly, which we'll get into. Your spawn director is in charge of your pit crew, and your race engineers are kind of in charge of your drivers, if we want to look at it that way. With that said, however, let's just get started with what probably most people consider to be the 2 more important ones, which is going to be your car development staff. So let's start with the technical chief, but as I mentioned here, both of these guys do work very similarly, which I'll explain in just a second. So your technical chief has basically a performance rating for each of the 6 different parts: the chassis, the front wing, the rear wing, the side pods, underfloor, and suspension. And this basically kind of signifies how good they are at making, or rather designing, these 6 different parts. Now, the way that the game handles this is pretty straightforward, and that is that every point that your staff members have is equal to 0.05%. This means that 100%, or rather 100 out of 100, is a 5% boost in that part's performance, if that makes sense. We'll also go over how the game calculates your design's performance. So let's just do that quick to give you a little bit of a better picture of what I mean by this. So when you design a part, the way that its performance is actually spread out is that 80% of it, 80% of that performance comes from your current expertise. You can gain an additional 10% from your staff members. This would be your technical chief and your head of aerodynamics. So as you can guess there, the 5% would be if you maximize the stats of, in this case, our technical chief, and then you'd have to have a maximized stat on your head of aero to get the full 10% boost. But your staff members do give you a fairly substantial boost on how your car does perform, particularly if you have maximized staff. But do consider it from the other perspective. Most teams aren't going to have staff that is rated lower than 80 anyways. So in general, this boost is a 1 to 2% advantage over other teams. Nothing too serious, but let's face it, in racing, every little advantage matters. Now, the remaining 10% comes from your buildings and your CFD/wind tunnel. This includes the building boost. So basically what this means is that if you put your CFD and wind tunnel on a part, it gets a small boost. However, if you maximize your wind tunnel and CFD buildings, that boost gets a little bit bigger. And if you have max wind tunnel time and max buildings, it can basically amount to about 5% extra performance gain. However, considering that you can only do this with 6 parts over the course of a year, and the final part you probably aren't even going to use, it's not really financially viable. And the expertise gain, which again is kind of what we care about the most with CFD and wind tunnel time, seem to still be the same no matter what level the buildings are. So unless you are really struggling for performance, you do want to do that, there's no need to actually focus on this part of the car. But we'll probably go over this in a different video, as it requires a little bit more math and going a little bit deeper into it. But for the purpose of this video, your staff, which is your technical chief and your head of aerodynamics, accounts for about a maximum of 10% of the car's performance. Now, as I mentioned here, the performance ratings for your technical chief is just straight up for that part. So if they have 100 in any of these 6 categories, that basically means that he's giving you a 5% boost to your designs, which of course is fairly substantial. But as I mentioned, most other teams should have their own staff around 80 or 90. So in reality, the advantage that you're getting here is going to be closer to just 1 to 2%. Now, as I mentioned, your head of aerodynamics works similarly, and he too can give you a 5% boost. But instead of having a boost for the part, he has boosts to different performance categories, like your cooling, your DRS delta, the 3 different types of cornering, your top speed, the airflow management, which basically again is multiplied to your cornering, and your airflow sensitivity, which would be, you know, dirty air. So while your chief, basically gives you a boost to the parts, this guy gives boost to the different stats within the part. But again, all of these again maximize 5%, and you can't have the same stat twice on a part. So if both of them are maxed, you get 10%. This guy too just gives 5, but you can basically a little bit easier here aim for the things that you would like to get boosted. In our case, most likely cornering. But you get the idea here. If both of these guys are max level, due to, you know, mentality, due to their overalls, you can expect a total of a 10% boost to your parts, which is substantial, don't get me wrong, but probably not vital in the long run. Because again, 80 rated staff, let's say both of these were 80 rated altogether, they would give us an 8% boost. And right now, because of Tondi's stats, we're not actually getting that full 10% boost. We're getting somewhere around 9.5%. And again, remember, 80 overall would be an 8% boost, so it's just 2% difference from being maxed, which means that they're not super important. Having 80 rated staff is perfectly fine. Now, another staff member that is probably a little bit more important, that I've also gone more in depth on in a different video, is your pit boss. And your pit boss is kind of important because they signify everything that you can do with your pit crew. They are your pit crew. Training, basically how quickly they train up the pit crew skills, how quickly they improve. Aptitude, skill ceiling, very important to reach those 1.8 second pit stops. Leadership, basically minimizes the time wasted when you do have an incident, like, you know, a botched pit stop. Processes, minimizes the fatigue gain, which means that less fatigue is gained from training and less fatigue is gained from race weekends. Also very important. But yeah, generally I'd say if you're going to be spending money on your staff members, your sporting director is probably going to be more important than getting a good technical chief, than getting a good head of aerodynamics. Now, your other two staff members are, of course, your race engineers, and they are kind of important in their own way. Now, your race engineers have the composure stat, which is actually fairly important because composure has an effect on your driver's confidence during races. A higher rating means less driver confidence loss from negative events, more driver confidence gain from positive events. So it's actually very important to make sure that you don't lose too much confidence from negatives and you gain more confidence from the positives. Affinity also kind of has an effect on this, as you can see, so having high affinity helps. And the way to race it quickly is through the communication skill. This basically has the effect that the higher this is, the faster the affinity grows between the race engineer and the driver. The last skill feedback here is basically just for setups. The higher this skill is, the quicker your driver will figure out if this setup suits him, the quicker you can get back into pits during practice and tweak it, that sort of thing. It's basically just how quickly your driver figures out the setup and if it's something they want to use. Now, other than that, there isn't really too much to the staff. There's nothing super, you know, special or things you need to worry about. They are pretty straightforward and simple. And again, I'd probably just recommend going for your sporting director first so you can start getting that absolute best pit stop. I think that's more important. And again, the maximum boost you can get out of your car development staff is 5% for each person, 10% total on your part. And again, your facilities is 5%. Your CFD can amount to 5%, but let's face it, that's not really going to happen. Because unless you have maximum CFD with maximum facilities, you're not going to reach that 5% boost number. And 80% of your car's performance is still going to be tied into your expertise levels. So it's more important to raise those than to do anything else. But if you have good staff, that's an extra 10% boost, allowing you to get up to 90, you know, of the potential, if you will. And then 95 with the facilities. And it could actually be kind of nice to probably mention that since I'm on how facilities work on the parts. So as you can see, if we look at the design center, it gives a 5% flat boost to airflow for sidewall chassis. You can actually see here that it does different parts. None of this does suspension. All of the suspension boosts are actually hidden in the suspension simulator. So this building just does just the suspension, and Car Part Test Center does some different stuff. But generally here again, every stat is going to add up to just 5% boosted. There is of course an exception that you've probably seen, and that is the cooling. Cooling is generally not affected too much by CFD to begin with, so you just get a flat out 10% boost from the car part test center here for your engine cooling, which is side pod and chassis, your tire preservation, which is front wing, and of course you get another 10% if this was at 100% from your suspension simulator. So cooling gets that little bit of a handout, if you will. They get a 10% flat, no CFD needed, so it's much easier to reach maximum cooling than it is anything else. And we can kind of actually show that here. If I were to go on the suspension here, and you can already see our tire preservation is 92% to start off with this season. If I were to maximize tire preservation and minimize everything else, we are still a little bit off. Let's be perfectly honest. We're missing 2% from the suspension sim. That's one. But you can actually reach 100% tire preservation if you try. And 241 is what we're getting here. We'll bring it up to 95%. And if we then go front wing and try and squeeze out a little bit more tire preservation from that too, you can probably get pretty close here to, well, not 100, but 96, 98. So as you can see, you can actually squeeze up to 100% if you really, really want to try for it. And again, that's because we don't need CFD to get there. And it's the same for the engine cooling. For the other types of cornering here, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. For instance, if we take a quick look at our rowing here, we're only, or rather we can use suspension to compare easier. We're about 87% here for both the airflows and drag reduction. And even for the cornering here, we aren't above about 70%. We're actually around 76% here for low speed. And that kind of does give you the idea that it's far easier to raise cooling than anything else on your car. But that's really it. Did go on a little bit of a tangent there at the end, but as you can imagine, your staff isn't necessarily something you need to be super worried about. Honestly, the best thing that your staff is doing right now is actually giving a mentality buff. This is probably going to get patched this coming week rather, so it isn't as powerful. But currently, for instance, our drivers is getting a bit of a buff here from the other staff, and that mentality buff, which probably isn't as, well shown on these guys, can be very, very important to your drivers. So getting higher rated staff for the mentality buff is definitely worth it as well. But other than that, again, it's not something you need to waste your entire budget on. Spend money on your staff if you can afford it, but getting a technical chief and a head of aerodynamics that is super good is not going to make or break your team. Again, 80% versus, 80 overall versus 100 overall. The difference is just 2% for your car. You are definitely going to be able to get more of that out of just focusing your expertise rather than, say, spending 10 million to break a contract. So keep that in mind. I would, however, recommend getting a good pit boss. And with that said, I hope this has been informative. I know I went on a little bit of a tangent here at the end with performance, but it's kind of important you understand that most of your car's performance is purely tied up in expertise. And I probably should make a video on what expertise is and how it works, but that will be another time. If it helped you, please like, subscribe, and if you have anything else that you're curious about, any questions, feel free to ask. Might take me a little bit of a time to answer as I'm getting back to work, but I'll do my best to respond when I have time. Also, if there's any other things that you're curious about in this game, any questions that you have, feel free to let me know, and I might just make a video on it. But thank you very much for watching, hope you've enjoyed, and I shall see you next time. Bye bye!